In 1941, an old man began hearing weird noises in his home, but each time he went to go check them, he found nothing. He didn't believe much in the supernatural, so he plainly figured it was just the house settling. Unfortunately, he was very wrong. The strange incidents continued for 5 weeks until the old man, Philip Peters, found something standing at his fridge. It appeared to be an abnormally slender, tall man, and Peters panicked, swinging his cane at it. However, the intruder swung back, knocking him to the ground. He then continued to bludgeon Peters until it was clear he was no longer alive. Peters' body was discovered later that day, but the police found no signs of forced entry and even noted that all the windows and doors were still locked. They did find a small trapdoor in the ceiling of a closet, but determined that it was physically impossible for anyone to enter it. Therefore, they never checked inside. Philip Peters' wife returned to the house soon after his death and hired a housekeeper to help her out. But once again, strange incidents kept occurring. They soon became convinced that the home was haunted, which led to the housekeeper's resignation and the widows moving away. But even after the house was vacated, the neighbors still noticed apparitions in the windows and lights flickering on in the middle of the night, but whenever they knocked, nobody would answer. After receiving so many calls about this house, the Denver police decided to station 2 officers outside to keep an eye on it. And late one night, they finally spotted the figure themselves. They ran inside and immediately heard a door handle move on the 2nd floor. They bolted after the sound and made it just in time to spot a pair of legs climbing up into the closet trapdoor. They reached inside, caught the man by his legs, and yanked him back out. The man's name was Theodore Coneys, and he'd come to be known as the Denver Spider-Man. He confessed to the murder of Philip Peters and admitted to living in the attic for roughly 9 months.
I don't think I have ever read about a scarier human being. I don't even think you can refer to this person as a human being. He's the most terrifying creature to ever walk the earth. Jamie Osuna, the man with 1,000 faces. Jamie was born and raised in Bakersfield, California. He had one of the absolute worst childhoods. Jamie's mom was only 19 years old when she had him. Her name is Michelle. I don't really like that one bit. Dad's name is unknown, but he was 21 at the time when Jamie was born. Michelle and the... I hate saying my name. Michelle and the dad's relationship was so toxic. The dad was so terrible to Michelle. She was constantly abused both mentally and physically. They do eventually end up getting a divorce. Michelle meets another man named Jeff. She ends up marrying him, moves in with him, bringing along Jamie and his half-brother. From the beginning, Jeff is cold to the kids. He has no interest in being a father figure to anyone. He ends up being horrible and abusive, and when I say horrible, do not take that lightly. When Jamie was a baby, Jeff pushes Jamie out of a moving vehicle in his car seat because he lost his temper. Later on, as Jamie starts to grow up, we discover that he actually did suffer brain damage from getting pushed out of a car. Even though it wasn't visible and you couldn't see it, he did have brain damage. The older brother moves out. Jamie stays living with Michelle and Jeff, and eventually Michelle and Jeff have their own children. Get this, Jeff was a good father to his own children, but he hated Jamie. He was normal to his children, but he would starve Jamie. He would lock him out of the house. He would hit him. Jeff would be absolutely cruel to Jamie just because he didn't like him, and Michelle never stood up for Jamie. At one point, Jeff actually does get charged for some of the things that he does to Jamie, but he's only held by authorities for a few days and then he goes right back home. When Jamie is 12, he has only ever dealt with hate and betrayal his entire life. Ever since before he was born, that is all he's ever been surrounded with. He doesn't know any different, but he ends up moving in with his grandparents. When Jamie's 15 years old, he goes to juvie for stabbing a guy. During his time in juvie, Jeff dies from a heart attack and Jamie is released from juvie at 19 years old. In December 2008, Jamie goes to a house party, and that is where he meets his future wife. I couldn't find her name. I don't think she wants her name out there, so we're just gonna call her Sarah. Sarah is a 37-year-old single mom. She's throwing a house party for her 16-year-old son. Jamie attended. That's where they met. At the party, Jamie... it's not funny. He's just like, why does he do this? At the party, Jamie stabs a man and the police is called. He gets sent back to jail, even though he just got out of jail. He can't stay out. While he's in jail, all he's thinking about is Sarah and how much he liked her. They start writing letters to each other for almost a full year. When Jamie is released in November 2009, Sarah goes to pick him up from jail and she's shocked to see how many tattoos, facial tattoos, he got. She picks him up, they go to a motel, do the deed, and Sarah ends up getting pregnant. Apparently, when they found out that they were going to have a baby, Jamie was excited to be a father. He was ready to step up and take care of the baby. In February of 2010, they agreed to be this little family and they end up getting married. After the wedding, Sarah is still pregnant and Jamie becomes very aggressive, very abusive. Because of that, he's sent back to jail for another 6 months. While he's in jail, the kid is born. He gets out, Sarah decides to give him another chance, but Jamie quickly makes her regret that. He was terrible to her in every and any way, and that abuse eventually went not only to Sarah, but also to her kids, as well as their new baby that they had. When he starts abusing the children, that is Sarah's bottom line, and Jamie has crossed it. She isn't having it anymore. She ends up calling the police on him. Jamie ends up back in prison for another 7 months. He's released on Halloween in 2011, and Jamie does not learn. He's a violent person. He's calling Sarah, threatening to kill her and the children. And Sarah is reporting all the phone calls and all the threats to the police. One day, November 8th, 2011, Jamie calls Sarah. Sarah's assuming that he's just calling to threaten her again. But when she picks up the phone, Jamie says, "Put on the news, I just killed a woman at the Morocco motel." Sarah immediately calls the police, and guess what they did? Absolutely not. It wasn't until 5 days later when a worker at the motel discovers the dead body of 37-year-old Yvette Peña. Yvette was a loving mother of 6. She was adored by so many people, leaving so many people absolutely heartbroken. Autopsy revealed that she had blunt force injuries, sharp force injuries, and she was strangled. Investigators have said it was the worst crime scene some of them have ever seen. The details of it all have not yet been released because it was so horrendous. Cops are called. They soon figure out that Jamie Osuna was responsible for this murder. So the cops are now looking for him, but they're having a really hard time finding him. It took 5 days to find him. They eventually do arrest him. Jamie denies that it was him, but he is charged, so he's awaiting trial, and during that time, he gets more facial tattoos. While he is awaiting trial, he's still doing everything that he can to harass Sarah. He wanted to ruin her life. He would send her letters written in blood. She once got a letter with a smashed up dead rat inside. Jamie would also send letters to people on the outside to try and get Sarah killed. He's awaiting trial for the murder for 5 years, and during that time there's a lot of hearings and a lot of time spent in court still. Yvette's family was at those hearings, and Jamie was so creepy. He would sit there smiling and waving at them like, ugh, just haunting them and taunting them. It was horrible. They finally set a trial date. 3 days before the trial, Jamie agrees to do an interview with a journalist, and this interview is horrifying. Up until then, he had not confessed to killing Yvette, right? But during this interview, before he's even asked, he says, "I did it." The clip of this interview, it's so creepy. Oh my god, it gives me shivers. The clip of him during this interview, it's so creepy. He says, "I'm sadistic. I really don't care. I did it and I'll do it again over and over and over." Another quote, "I did sadistically, premeditately, and deliberately torture and murder Yvette Peña." During that interview as well, he talks about his childhood, his trauma. He says that from when he was a kid around 8, 9 years old, he started killing animals. He says he doesn't care about killing. He just likes to chase the rush to feel something, and says that he gets self-gratification from it. He confesses not only to killing Yvette, but he says she was not the first person that he's killed. He's actually done it twice before. He says his first kill was in 2007 when he was 13. He killed a 32-year-old female. They ask him the reason why he did that, and he says, "I kind of don't want to get into that because I was young at that age, but that was the first taste." I just can't get over the way that he presents himself at the trial for Yvette. He's still doing little waves to the family, doing all these creepy smiles. Yvette's sister gets up and does a speech and says, "I do hope he will have some sort of regret." The camera turns to Jamie while the sister is talking, and he's mouthing, "No, no, 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 no," and smiling. He takes a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, and he's sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Did you think that was the end of the story? Wrong. In jail, it's decided that he is way too dangerous to have a cellmate. He's threatening everyone in prison. He's stabbing inmates, including stabs to the face. He always had blood, and he would write messages on the cell walls with blood. It wasn't until March 2019 when Jamie was giving a cellmate for the first time. His cellmate was 44-year-old Luis Romero. By March 9th, 2018, they had not even been cellmates for 24 hours. Luis was found dead in his cell, and the details of this crime scene, this is a warning. In the cell, Jamie is covered in blood. He somehow got a hold of a razor. He made a makeshift knife. He used that to attack Luis. He cut off his fingers. He cut out his eyes. He removed part of his ribs, cut out one of his lungs, decapitated Luis, and then carved the Joker's smile onto his face. Like, yeah. When they were found, there was blood all over, obviously. Jamie was sitting there with body parts all around him, and he was wearing a necklace made out of Luis's body parts. On the cell wall, it was written in blood, "Ha ha ha," and then I am the man with 1,000 faces. Jamie also asked to be given photos of the crime scene, and thankfully the judge denied. That is the story of Jamie Osuna. I told you he was literally the scariest person to ever live.
A school bus filled with 26 children, all kidnapped and buried alive. This is the largest case of mass kidnapping in American history. The Chowchilla kidnapping, this is one of the most bizarre true crime cases. You're gonna think that I'm telling you the plot of a movie. Ed Ray was the school bus driver that fateful day in California in 1976. He's driving his normal bus route. He's driving on a more rural stretch of land when he notices a white van stopped in the middle of the road. Thinking that maybe they're experiencing some kind of car trouble, he pulls over to try and help them, and that's when two men get out of the van. They have nylon stockings over their heads and they're carrying large weapons, and they start approaching the school bus. Ed has 26 children on his school bus, ranging in ages from 5 years old to 14 years old, and he's terrified if he makes one wrong move that these men are going to open fire on all these children. So for the time being, he complies with whatever they say. The two men hijack the school bus and begin driving it away, while a third kidnapper is following behind them in the white van. They drove to a secluded area, and that's when they loaded the 26 children and the school bus driver Ed into two vans, and then they drove those vans 12 hours. And the back of the vans are completely boarded up, so they're in these vans for 12 hours in total darkness. Can you even imagine the fear and confusion? Ed is the only adult in the situation, trying his best to be responsible for 26 children, try and keep them calm and keep them safe. And meanwhile, back home, dozens of parents are realizing that their children have not come home from school. The authorities find the school bus just abandoned in that secluded area, and now there's massive panic. Everyone knew about this for miles. Could you even imagine 26 children and their bus driver just all vanishing into thin air? And the phone lines are absolutely being blown up with hundreds of calls. People are calling in with tips or theories. The media is calling. Concerned family members and community members are calling. The phones are ringing off the hook. Meanwhile, the children and Ed have been in the back of this van driving for 12 hours. They're taken over 100 miles away from home. And then the van stops. And the three men, they come, open the door, and they take Ed, and then they slam the door. And then a while later, they go back and they take another child and then slam the door. And then a bit later, they go and take another child and they slam the door, and this continues. And the people, the children that are still left in the van, have no idea what's happening to their friends or if they're even alive. Luckily, they were all alive. The three kidnappers took them all, each one by one, asked them what their names were, then made them remove what they were wearing, and then directed them to climb down into a hole that they had buried underground. The three kidnappers had buried a small moving van underground, and it was small, 27 feet long, and now there's 27 people in it. There was dirty mattresses on the ground, a small amount of food and water, and then the kidnappers took one single roll of toilet paper, threw it down at them, and then told the 26 children and Ed that they would be back for them later, and then covered the hole with a manhole grate. I keep going back to how terrifying this situation would be for anyone, but this is happening to children as young as 5 years old. And then they hear dirt being thrown on top of that manhole cover. They are being buried alive 12 feet underground. And you're probably all wondering, what kind of monsters are doing this? Well, you might be surprised to learn that these three kidnappers are all in their early 20s and extremely wealthy. For context, the ringleader in this mass kidnapping scheme, Fred Woods' family made $80 million the year this happened in 1976, which would be almost $400 million in today's money. And Fred's accomplices were brothers named James and Richard Schoenfeld, and they also came from a wealthy family, but all three men were lazy and did not want to work and were being cut off from daddy's money. They're all in massive debt, but they're lazy. They don't want to work. They want a get-rich-quick scheme, and that's how they came up with the idea to kidnap a school bus full of children so they could ask the state of California for a $5 million ransom for the children's safe return. And they planned this out for about a year and a half. And after they buried the 26 children and Ed underground, they went back home to call the authorities and make the ransom demand. But remember, the phones are ringing off the hook with those hundreds of calls of tips and the media and concerned citizens. So their call for ransom demand could not go through. The three men decided that they were just going to try and call later. And in the meantime, they would take a little nap. You know, they had such a long day, but they napped so long, in fact, that Ed and the 26 children had been buried underground for over 12 hours. And they were running out of air. The small amount of food and water that the kidnappers have left for them, it was gone. The chances of them even getting out of this hole alive to be given up for ransom were looking slim. It had been over 12 hours and the kidnappers never came back like they said they would. And this just shows the amount of bravery and the will to survive that these children had, because they were going to get out of here. They began stacking those mattresses that were thrown on the ground on top of each other and then started to stand on each other's shoulders so they could reach that manhole cover 12 feet above them. The oldest of the children was a 14-year-old boy named Michael Marshall, and he was able to kind of wiggle the manhole a little bit. So Ed, the bus driver, he climbs up and he holds it open to him just a little bit so that Michael was able to go in and wedge a piece of wood so he's able to wiggle the manhole actually off. The kidnappers had also put a heavy wooden box on top of the manhole, so 14-year-old Michael starts bashing at the wood and tearing at it with his bare hands until 16 hours after they were first imprisoned, he sees sunlight. 14-year-old Michael has just freed them. He's so brave because he's the first one to leave the hole, and he has no idea if the kidnappers are going to be out there waiting for him. And then Ed lifts each child one by one to Michael until they're all free. All 27 of them are outside of the hole, and now they're looking around and they're in the middle of nowhere. There's just rolling California hills surrounding all of them. They're in this like mining area. They actually have been buried under a rock quarry. And there was an employee at the rock quarry that was about to go home. His shift was over, and he sees these 26 children and Ed just wandering around and realizes that they are the kidnapped children that everyone's been talking about. And when Dumb and Dumber finally wake up from their nap, they see on the news that, oh, all our kidnapping victims have been found alive. They tried to flee the country. It was actually extremely easy to identify that these men were the ones who did this because the rock quarry that they were all buried under, it belonged to Fred's father. And Fred had been seen by multiple employees digging holes at the rock quarry. And since Fred really only hung out with the Schoenfeld brothers, they were easy suspects. And their homes were just filled with evidence, including all of the kidnapped children's names just written on a fast food bag. They found a draft of the ransom letter, and then they also found a document just titled Plan that documented and described all of their plan in a lot of detail. All three men were eventually brought into custody and charged with 27 counts of kidnapping and 5 counts of kidnapping with bodily harm. A lot of the children were actually brave enough to testify and face their kidnappers, and all three men were found guilty of all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But all three men were able to successfully appeal the bodily harm charges because, you know, technically they didn't beat them or anything. But all, or at least most of the children and Ed suffered with lifelong PTSD, trauma, anxiety, on top of the fact that they almost died down in that hole and they had to fight their way out to survive. But the court system decided that they did not count as bodily harm enough. So their sentences were all reduced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, and today all men have been released on parole. Richard was released in 2012, James was released in 2015, and Fred was released pretty recently in 2022.
This is the horrifying murder of Emma Kelty. 43-year-old Emma was a head teacher from Surbiton in southwest London. After the heartbreaking death of her father, Emma decided that she wanted to go and live life to the fullest. She sold her flat, she quit her job, and decided to go out solo travelling. Emma was already a very experienced solo traveller. She had already been to the South Pole, where she was the 6th woman to ever ski there alone. She had spent over 50 days by herself in Antarctica, and she had hiked over 2,500 miles across North America. Emma decided that her next challenge was that she was going to kayak all the way along the Amazon River, which is over 4,000 miles long. On the 15th of June 2017, Emma flew to Peru to begin her journey, which she documented well across her blog, Instagram, and Twitter account. And Emma would go on to tweet some of the scary things that she experienced, including a woman holding a child while waving a machete at her, coming across a group of men in boats, all of which were armed with arrows, and a time where she was sat for over 2 hours waiting to undress out of some wet clothes, but she couldn't because some men had parked up next to her and were just sat lingering watching her. She tweeted about her lack of sleep, that people would come up to her tent and shine torches to her, and eerily, one of the final things that she tweeted was a warning that she received from some locals. The next leg of her journey was an incredibly dangerous one, and the locals had warned her that she would either get her boat stolen from her or that she would be killed. On the 12th of September, Emma would pitch her tent nearby the remote quarry. As she was sat inside of her tent, she would be spotted by a gang of 5 men who were named the Water Pirates. These men were aged between their late teens up to their 20s. Upon seeing Emma's tent, the Water Pirates believed that she was actually a Colombian person who was smuggling drugs and they wanted to steal it, so they began to shoot into the tent. Emma would be struck in the arm and she came out of her tent waving her arms, showing that she wasn't a threat and crying out for help. The men would pounce on Emma, threatening her and demanding her to hand over the drugs that she didn't even have. They would abduct Emma, forcing her against her will into their boat, which was confirmed as some locals saw her inside of their boat. The gang would go on to brutally and repeatedly rape Emma. They tortured her, cutting off her hair using a knife, and even attempted to behead her, slitting her throat and cutting at her shoulder. Before being thrown into the Amazon River, profusely bleeding, which would attract the piranhas, Emma would be fatally shot in the head. The pirates had actually stolen several of Emma's electronic devices, including her GPS device, and while fiddling around with it, one of the pirates accidentally set off the SOS signal, which would lead the police directly to them once they began to search for Emma. Brazilian police, alongside the Brazilian Navy, would be able to recover some of Emma's belongings, including her tent, but sadly, to this day, Emma's body has never been found. The full gang of pirates would eventually be tracked down, and the main perpetrator, the man who allegedly shot Emma, was actually already murdered by a rival gang by the time the police came to find him. 3 of the other members would be incarcerated, although I couldn't find any information about their sentences. And finally, one of the pirates who had been on the run since 2017 was actually apprehended only last year after he took his daughter to hospital. He would be arrested and charged with murder and handed a sentence of 29 years and 11 months to serve.